I'm Brian Lawler. I'm a professor at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California. I'll be talking about color management in this section. Color management is the process of measuring and using what are called ICC profiles to describe the behavior of computer displays, digital cameras, and printing devices. And when built into a color-managed workflow, those profiles allow us to control the accuracy of the capture, the maintenance, and the reproduction of color from start to finish. To do that, we build a workflow, and I'll be explaining that workflow in the following steps. So the first thing that you want to do when you're back in the lab is to make sure that your display is profiled. Now you can do that using your eyes. On a Macintosh computer, there's software provided in the operating system that makes it possible to calibrate and profile the display. You can also make the display accurate by using a device called a colorimeter, which is an instrument that sits on the display and measures its performance. The result of using that instrument is also a profile, and the profile describes the behavior of the display, but it also causes the display to show color as accurately as possible. And that's a theme in color management. I'm going to be sure to set the color correctly of this image, and I can do that in Adobe Camera Raw by establishing the color space in which I intend to work. In this case, I'm going to be working in Adobe RGB 1998, which is one of many color spaces. It's very popular with professional photographers, and it's large enough to accommodate most printing processes, including the most popular sheet-fed profiling system, which is called G7. So I set the color space to Adobe RGB 1998. I'm working in Camera Raw here. One of the things that I have to know about my photograph is what was the color temperature of the light source. And when you're working in a studio, we happen to know that. It's 5,600 Kelvin. So I can establish that to balance the color correctly for strobe flash. And then I can establish any other editorial color correction changes that I'd like to make on the image before I open it. Once I open the image, I need to know that the screen is displaying the color correctly. And that's the first place where color management comes into play. So in order to do that, the simplest way to do this is to work with a profiling instrument, or you can use on Macintosh computers, you can use a visual technique for calibrating a display that involves adjusting the contrast of the display in 5 stages by changing very, very subtle differences between the appearance of 2 gray spaces on the screen, and if necessary, you can adjust the color. At the end of that process, you have what's called a visually calibrated display. And interestingly, this allows you to build, it automatically builds, a calibration profile for this display. It's unique to this machine, and it's unique to these circumstances. Once that display profile is complete, I can be confident that my display is showing the color to me correctly on the screen. I date my profiles so that I know when I made them, and that way I can tell whether the profile that I'm using today is the one that was made most recently. Once I've made those corrections, changes to the way that the display shows color, I can be quite confident that the image that I see on the screen is being displayed correctly. Now, the second part of the process is that I'm going to save the file with an embedded profile. And here in Adobe Photoshop, it allows me to embed the color profile, Adobe RGB 1998, and I'm going to put a Photoshop version of this file back on the screen. And any touch-up, cropping, and adjustment to the photograph that needs to be done, I need to do before I move to the next step. I'd like to brighten this image just a little bit, so I'm going to make an adjustment to its appearance, making it a little bit brighter overall. And that's called a non-destructive adjustment layer in Adobe Photoshop. And I also have some editorial adjustments that I could make to the photograph, but that's for another lesson. So we'll move on with color management. I save the file again, and then I can move on in the process of making a page layout. Profiling is the process of measuring the behavior of press, paper, and ink. And in order to do that, we have to make a special target. That target, the most popular one, is called an IT 8.7. The IT 8.7 chart is a set of something like 1,600 little color patches, and it is used to print and then measure the behavior of a printing device. Now, I'll be using an inkjet printing device in one of these examples, but we could just as easily put that IT 8.7 target onto a Heidelberg press. When we do that and we bring it back into the lab, we can then measure the behavior of the press, paper, and ink, and we can build a profile which describes the behavior of the press, the paper, and the ink that we use to make the target. Now I'm holding here an IT 8.7 target that was printed on a Heidelberg press. I'm going to take that target now and I'm going to put it into a device called a spectrophotometer. The spectrophotometer reads the 1,600 patches and delivers to the computer spectral information about all of those colors that the computer can then use to calculate a profile. After a test target is printed, we measure it using a spectrophotometer. This instrument is called an I1 ISIS. It's manufactured by the X-Rite Corporation. It's one of several spectrophotometer instruments that they make. The instrument first checks the validity of the target, and then after determining that the target is a valid target, it begins reading. The patches are read in sequence using two spectral instruments inside the scanning spectrophotometer, and it takes 4 to 5 minutes to read the entire target. Once the instrument finishes reading the patches on the target, it begins the profiling phase. After a profile is made, we use a special software called ColorThink Pro that allows us to analyze the profile to determine if it is valid and that it represents colors correctly. In this case, I'm demonstrating the profile that was created from an inkjet printer, an Epson 9800, that has a tremendously large gamut, much larger than commercial printing presses, and capable, therefore capable of being used as a proofing printer for almost any printing process because the gamut is so large. One of the benefits of using this profile maker software is that it's easily possible to compare one gamut of colors to another. In this case, I'm going to turn the Epson printer into a wireframe, and the wireframe encloses inside the profile for a printing press, a profile called Grackle. Now, Grackle is a sheet-fed standard for North America, and it's as you can see from this three-dimensional diagram here, it's smaller than the gamut of colors on the Epson inkjet printer. And that's actually good. It's realistic, and if shown in two-dimensional charts, you see that the smaller chart here is the representation of the color gamut of the Grackle printing press. The larger gamut is the representation of the color gamut of the Epson inkjet printer. So because one is larger than the other, I can use the Epson inkjet printer as a proofer to demonstrate in advance what the press sheet will look like when it comes off of an offset press. When building a document in Adobe InDesign, in this case with a series of color photographs, each of those photographs brings with it an embedded color profile from the camera that created the file. When we build the document, though, we have to convert the colors from their native red, green, blue color space into cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, CMYK, for a printing press. We can do that at the same time that we create a PDF file. So if we make a PDF for print, we can save the file, assigning the proper profile, in this case, coated Grackle for sheet-fed printing, and then make a PDF file that has all of the colors converted to CMYK and ready to print. And that is the completion of our workflow for this particular process. Now there's a lot more to color management than I've been able to cover in this particular segment, but I've covered the basics. The idea is to develop a workflow. We manage the color from the camera, we manage the color on the display, and then we measure and manage the color on the press. And by doing so, our success is nearly guaranteed.